So welcome everybody to this research seminar. I'm happy that so many are here, even though it's a fantastic sunny day. But I feel very sorry for the people who are not here, because Malcolm is going to give a talk about explaining environmental successes and failures. To say the least, a very pertinent talk and very interesting talk, I'm sure. So Malcolm has actually been here at the Institute since 2018. That's quite a long time now. He's recently appointed as the chair professor of sociology at Uppsala University. Got his PhD once upon a time in sociology from University of California, Berkeley, 2006. On neoliberal mercantilism and North American free trade. And your research, is very much about better protecting the global climate and natural environment, and the politics of environmental policy making and economics. Earlier, of course, as we saw from his thesis on economics of globalization and social trust. Published a book that I can recommend, Free Trades, Elites, Democracy, and the Rise of Globalization at UUP. And then a trailblazing paper called Governing for Future Generations, How Political Trust Shape Attitudes Toward Climate and Debt Policies. I recommend everybody to read that paper. The floor is yours.
Thanks. I've been coming to the Institute for even longer than that. First time I came was the spring of 2015. And this place has changed my life in multiple ways. So I'm very grateful to it and many colleagues, and Gustav in particular. So let me just start by acknowledging a bunch of different grants that have kind of contributed to supported work that I've done that is shaping the thoughts I'm going to share today. This is going to be a very, very broad talk. Rather than specialized, I'm going to try to summarize a huge amount of stuff. And I have benefited a great deal from the communities around the climate ethics program, SustPop project, and then I should mention a couple of PhD students who are working on specific parts of this with me here, Carolina and Marcus. Also Tim Bartley, a collaborator in the US, and then most recently a new 4MS funded project with Pontus and Steve, although the work we've done so far on that is a little bit less related to what I'm talking about today. But in short, thank you. And many people are in different ways wrapped up in what I'm about to say. So, climate change is in some ways one of humanity's sort of most pathetic moments, right? Like just abysmal failure. Like it's pretty bad in terms of performance. But you know that. It's also pretty bad in terms of performance on sort of doing anything for all the other forms of life that we share this planet with. It's grotesque, right? We're killing off birds and mammals and basically anything that isn't us or something that's immediately useful to us. This is really one of humanity's sort of worst ever accomplishments. But you know that. What gets a little bit less press is that, humanity's actually done phenomenally well on some other environmental challenges. So when I was a kid, the ozone layer, the ozone hole was one of the scariest environmental problems of them all. Arguably the most scary because, without it, we would all get skin cancer and die. Some get skin cancer anyway, but the rates would be far, far higher. Catastrophically higher. And arguably, this was humanity's finest hour ever with respect to anything. Global problem in the age of the Cold War, scientists sort of pointed to this thing that was happening and, no muss, no fuss. Essentially, we did the very sensible things that were required to bring down emissions of ozone depleting substances. Phenomenal. Global cooperation, the whole works. And it's not the only case. Sulfur dioxide also used to be one of the world's most serious environmental problems. It's the main cause of acid rain. Now, acid rain, a little bit abstract, but basically it means, rain and snow were literally 10 or even 100 times more acidic than they would be naturally. They fall into rivers and streams and lakes and bioaccumulate and kill stuff off and even erode buildings. And it turns out sulfur dioxide is also really bad for our health. We've brought it down. Leaded petrol is one of the great scandals of the 20th century. So lead is actually not a natural ingredient in fuel. It was intentionally added by corporations because it solved a sort of technical problem with the internal combustion engine for a long time. And so for decades, we literally added it to the fuel, used by machines that are all around us. And it affected children's brain development. until quite recently. So I, without joking, can say I am a couple of IQ points dumber than I would have been if lead had not been added to fuel in the time that, I was a baby and a child. And so were all of you. So on the positive side, this has now been eliminated in every country of the world. The last one to do it was Algeria in 2021. So again, this is actually quite a big success story. Children from now on will grow up, much healthier and smarter because of this move. And it's one of the explanations that's provided for why crime rates have actually come down in many places as well. Children have better sort of impulse control and grow up as adults with better impulse control. And we know that this has actually made an impact because we have time series like this. So this is Swedish children's blood, lead content, and it's come down over time. Dioxins are another one. So dioxins are produced in certain sorts of combustion environments. Incinerators used to emit them. Also the production of pulp and paper, including in this country, used to emit a lot. And we can measure it in various kinds of ways. It's highly certain. There's lots of different kinds of dioxins, but some of them, many of them are actually extremely carcinogenic. And they too, we have substantially alleviated. So our bodies are freer from this extremely toxic substance. Not to mention the bodies of all kinds of other animals as well. Mercury is extremely bad for us. We don't want any in our bodies if we can avoid it. It's also takes a very long time to get out of the environment once it's there. So in the region of the world where we live, Fennoscandia, fish have literally gotten freer from mercury in our lifetimes. So I don't know how many of these cases you all kind of knew about. Most of them are not reported in the media very much, but I think they're all extremely notable. And here's a way to make the comparison really sort of, explicit. Power plants, we've got good data from the US, that's why it's here, but the same thing could be said of many other places, are the source of different emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, but also the sort of acid rain causing emissions that I mentioned. And, in the sort of early 90s, decisions were made to deal with some of them, but not others. You can see how the trend lines have moved extremely differently, literally from the same smokestacks. Some of the stuff we don't want has now gone away, and some of it is largely still there. Now, social scientists kind of grapple with climate change, with graphics like this. So this is one I generated recently using International Energy Agency data. So if you plot greenhouse gas emissions per capita against standards of living captured by GDP per capita, the pattern is relatively clear, but there's also a lot of variation around that line, right? So you've got relatively good performers, France, Britain, Sweden, Denmark, and you've got atrocious performers like New Zealand, Canada, US, Australia, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Oman. And, as you might guess, some of this is to do with production of production of fossil fuels. So if you just plot the same thing on the vertical axis against, fossil fuel production, fossil fuel producing countries are atrocious. I come from one, I should know. Norway is kind of, as you can see, quite an astounding case, but still pretty bad in the global scale. But in a way, much as I'm interested in this, and I do research around this question of why some countries are doing much better or worse on climate change than others, in a sense, I think it's the wrong question. And the question that I want to grapple with today is a different one. Oh, I should say, there was this lovely moment, when was it? Yeah, a few months ago, December, where, the Climate and Environment Minister of Canada, who I met a couple of years ago when he came for Stockholm Plus 50, said this delicious thing. Somebody asked him, well, Canada keeps setting these greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. Why don't we hit them? We never tried. That's the honest answer. It was a brutally politically honest statement, and I loved it because it's true. This is why Canada has never hit its targets, because it just hasn't really tried. So what are all the different sort of social science perspectives or theories that have been brought to bear on the environment as a topic over the years and decades? Here they are from a bunch of different disciplines that I know of. Maybe there's others. If there are, please, we can talk about them, or you can approach me afterwards, see if I'm missing some perspective. I won't go through all of these, but suffice to say, none of them explain sort of differences across environmental problems. None of them provide any indication for why we should be doing so much better on some problems than others. And social scientists kind of instinctively, and I include myself in this, tend to focus on different societies' relative performance on a given environmental problem. So, why is Sweden relatively good on climate change? Canada's an atrocity, Australia, whatever. But in a sense, I think, as I said, that's the wrong question. And I think the right question at this point is, why is the entire world's performance so different on different environmental problems? Why have we done so poorly on climate change, so well on the ozone layer and the other things? Okay, well, let me switch gears saying, well, what's the sort of instinctive answer that people give towards solving the problem of climate change? One perspective is what we really need is everybody to get out in the streets. We need a massive social movement. I know scholars who basically, the driving sort of intuition behind the research they do around climate change is we just need to find a way to mobilize. We have a big mobilization. That's the big hurdle. Another kind of perspective says, we need some sort of economic degrowth. We need some kind of voluntary, green lifestyles, voluntary simplicity, whatever you want to call it. Maybe there are others. I'm going to get into some others, but we can talk about this. But what is the sort of plausible story that anybody can tell about how we're actually going to do this? We're clearly still sort of moving around in the mud, trying to figure it out. So my question is, what can we learn from the past environmental successes? If we look backwards and say, well, these were all scary problems, and we've done something very positive on these cases that I've just described briefly to you, what do they tell us? What did policymakers do? What did different social actors have to say about these things at different points? And how did we kind of get over the humps in successfully addressing all of those? Because frankly, we need some ideas to deal with the problems we've got today. One solution for climate change is we should simply spend big, and outcompete fossil fuels. That's basically what the US Inflation Reduction Act does. It includes no disincentive to fossil fuels. It just tries to outcompete them by making other things better.
But keeping the subsidies.
Well, huge amounts of subsidies.
Yeah, for fossil fuels.
Yeah, but I think soft subsidies for fossil fuels are overrated. They're there, but they're not that big. That's not why fossil fuels win. It's because, well, I'm going to come to that. Another approach, which I know, Gustav, you've sort of taken some interest in, is sort of analogies, for example, with the purchasing of slaves from slave owners, and basically saying, we're going to liberate these people, they're your property, so we're going to compensate you. Essentially taking a really morally disgusting kind of dive to solve a problem.
It's me.
I wasn't trying to criticize you. I think it's we should talk about it. But it involves spending a huge amount of money to basically convince people to let us do the right thing. And, either of these could be sort of linked to John Broom's concept of a world climate bank, where we essentially throw the debt for solving the problem onto future generations. The logic of this being, we can give essentially future generations a kind of thought experiment choice. Would you like to have low debt and an uninhabitable planet, or a habitable planet, but, some debt? Okay, well, we're going to give you some debt, but we're going to save the world for you. So hopefully you accept that when you're here 100 years from now. That's the logic of the World Climate Bank. But you could, sort of link it to these things. But let me return to these kind of past cases and think of them, as comparative outcomes, successes, failures, and what, as I say, can we learn from them? And the basic thesis I want to sort of advocate today is that the private sector, capitalists, industries, firms are really the sort of pivot actors, I think, in the story of all of these. They play really vital roles in kind of resisting or accepting or embracing or avoiding public regulation And it's ultimately public regulation that has saved us in all of these cases, and that I think is necessary to save us from the challenges that we now confront. So part of the story here is market responses to regulation. So if governments put in place sort of regulatory frameworks, environmental laws, whatever that may be, I'll talk about some of the specifics as we go. What do the market actors kind of do to deal with that? But then the other big question is, what do the market actors do to influence the regulation? What's the corporate lobbying story in each of these cases? And then the sort of associated questions with each of the cases from the perspective of now and the stories people tell about how we might solve climate change. If we look backwards and say, well, was it the case that getting huge numbers of people into the street was the solution to the problem? If people are saying that's what we need to solve climate change, is that retrospectively what worked in these other cases? How much kind of public consciousness was there around each of these things? And how much sort of public pressure was there to do something about it? And as I say, I want to sort of give a lot of emphasis to the roles of the relevant industries. So here's my basic kind of very simple schema of how I think the world, stops or doesn't stop environmental degradation. Policy outcomes, determine all, but where do policy outcomes originate from? Well, I think we can see them as sort of the product of, social movements, definitely to some degree, public attitudes, public opinion, public concerns, values, and so on. And, the sort of input of the relevant industries that are, the big actors causing the problem. And all of these things are kind of refracted through, politicians, public administrators, public authorities, and agencies, and yield these policy outcomes that matter. Now, in giving prior versions of this presentation, I've gradually been convinced to include this additional arrow, which is that politicians in turn try to kind of convince the electorate, voters, or even, in non-democratic countries, non-voters, the general population, to believe different things. So the I don't know, Polish government or Donald Trump or whoever says, climate change, Chinese hoax, whatever it is, right? Different governments in turn try to sort of mobilize their populations to think different things.
Just a question of clarification. These arrows, what are they? Like you're trying to influence it, but it doesn't involve coercive measures and things like that? So
it could be coercive measures.
State actors on social moments wouldn't be an arrow there. I mean, they try to control.
I suppose, yeah, you could add an extra arrow going backwards. So, I guess the state could basically shoot people if you're in a very authoritarian environment and social movements are a threat to you. Yeah, okay, good point. I think what I'm trying to do here is balance comprehensiveness and parsimony. So the question is whether that arrow is sort of important enough in enough places with respect to enough things that we want to complicate the diagram with it. I'll think about that, though. I think your suggestion is good. The other one that people have sort of strongly advocated when I presented this and said, well, what about science? Science sort of is in the background. Without science, very few environmental problems maybe would even enter the public consciousness, enter the consciousness of the authorities, public authorities, or in a sense, would industry even have to respond, right? So if scientists didn't say, here's the problem, industry wouldn't have to say, oh no, now they're going to regulate us because we're causing this problem the scientists are talking about. So in a sense, science is also the impetus to industry lobbying because science threatens industry. Hey guys, there's this global warming thing. And they're like, oh, now we got a problem. So there's a few factors we could think about in discriminating among these different environmental problems that set them apart from each other. So, there could be genuine scientific uncertainty that varies across things, right? So there are environmental problems that we, I think plausibly still don't fully understand the parameters of, whether that's neonicotinoids possibly killing off the bees or, certain kinds of pesticides, like how toxic are they really? Fracking has been one that's been a lot, there's been a lot of debate about it. Aside from the fact it pushes up the fossil fuels, like does the process of fracking itself do a lot of harm? I do think there are legitimate sort of scientific debates, and arguably some of these uncertainties could feed into inactivity versus activity on different problems. But of the cases I've talked about, I don't think there's that much of a role for this. I would basically discount that. Scientists have known with a high level of confidence that we were warming the climate and doing it with fossil fuels for a very long time. So I don't think genuine scientific uncertainty in particular can explain why we failed so much on climate change. Technological substitutes, some people say, well, you know, we didn't have anything to kind of substitute for fossil fuels. You know, what was the alternative? And the alternative is what we now know we could have always invented because we've invented it now. You know, solar panels and wind turbines are phenomenally good. You can even make, I think, a decent case for hydroelectric dams and, you know, nuclear power. I don't think nuclear is pretty, but I'm actually not opposed to it. And all of those things are, you know, very low carbon sources of abundant amounts of electricity now in the world. Imagine we had simply started rolling those out, you know, 30, 40 years ago when we knew climate change was coming and fossil fuels were going to do us. We didn't. Now, admittedly, the technologies weren't as good back then, although nuclear and hydroelectric were always there. Solar panels and wind turbines have come a phenomenally long way in the last 15 years. But that's because we've actually finally invested in developing them, and we didn't before. So what I've noted down here is that science and technology are, as economists would say, endogenous. In other words, they are actually social choices. They are the products of policy decisions. And the question is, why in the world did policymakers not put in place the framework to develop these things earlier? Now, of course, climate change arguably has the particularly pernicious quality that its effects are sort of, you know, dispersed in space and time. You know, all of us driving a car or doing whatever we do to cause some, you know, emission of greenhouse gas basically are imposing a cost on everybody else out there, including people who aren't born yet and people in other countries and so on. So, you know, it's a massive, massive scale externality. And that arguably sets it apart from, for example, very local scale environmental problems where, you know, if you pollute, the costs are borne by people right around you. You know, you don't literally pollute your own water source if you know you're going to be drinking it, typically. But I don't know that's actually really so different than some of these other problems. I'm not convinced that this also actually explains it. I think some of the other environmental problems also have quite spatially and temporally displaced kind of consequences and aren't in a sense so different. Okay, so industry, when it's threatened by scientific information and findings that suggest it's somehow destroying the Earth, you know, clearing out the ozone layer, warming the Earth, causing human health problems in whatever way, you know, the relevant industry that's polluting the world in some fashion can take a variety of stances in contemplating the possibility of regulators then doing something in light of the scientific information. They can totally resist. They can totally oppose any regulation. They can totally try to even deny the science or say it's totally uncertain, let's not take action yet. And of course, I'm describing exactly what the fossil fuels companies did. And essentially in another domain, what the tobacco companies did, right? So this is the merchants of doubt story of Oreskes and Conway. But as I will show, it's not always the case that that's how industries respond to scientific findings that point the finger at what they're doing. They can also, in some cases, accept regulation and say, okay, well, it's a drag for us, but we can kind of see why you're doing this. We're going to change our practices because you're going to regulate us, and we accept that. In some cases, industries actually, for strategic reasons, encourage regulation. There are instances in which you can actually make more money if regulators put in place certain rules that, for example, are a bigger disadvantage for your competitor than for you. It's capitalism, right? Of course, it's a game. It's a competitive game. And any little edge you can get against that other chemical factory in that other country, well, you know, the regulators help me do it, that's great. You can also avoid regulation. You know, you can find some equally or even more pernicious product that isn't yet sort of attacked or targeted by the regulators and substitute that for what you're currently doing. Or, of course, you can illegally sort of evade the regulations and just, risk getting caught, break the law. But again, I don't actually think the cases I've talked about, I don't think the problem with climate change is that firms are breaking the law. The problem is we don't have enough law. So in the successful cases, this is what I think basically happened. Scientific findings came out, pointed to the damage that firms were doing. And initially, in pretty much every case, the sort of instinctive reaction, if somebody comes to you and says, you're causing harm, says, me, I'm a good person, I'm just making widgets. Nobody really feels good when you come and are told that, you're causing cancer in children or whatever. So, instinctively, industries kind of deny. That's where they all start. Now, the interesting thing is to deny and to block regulation is a collective action problem for firms. Politics costs money, right? If you're going to lobby national governments, you have to pay lobbyists. You have to pay campaigns. You have to pay for media space to send out your message to the public, to voters, whatever. That costs money and it requires coordination. So I don't think this is a conspiracy. This is normal, political activity of businesses to sort of shape the political process. But it requires a relatively united front, because if you're in a market with, say, 4 major corporations providing something, and one of them suddenly says, you know what, science is right, we've got a problem here, we need to change. That creates a big problem for the other 3 companies if that company got out in front. If they have had their engineers working on new technology that will be okay in the context of a new regulatory environment, they're going to make a lot of money. So industry, on the one hand, has a sort of solidary kind of character in the face of scientific threats. But on the other hand, there's a constant threat of defection. There's a threat that individual firms will suddenly leap out of the industry consensus and move ahead. And in all the success cases, that's what happens. So something breaks the industry consensus. So some subsector or some firm has a reason to change strategy and breaks the industry collective action on the politics. There is also, I think, in some cases, a role for increasing scientific certainty. So on the lead case, for example, there literally, the industry was denying that adding lead to fuel was actually doing any social harm for a really long time. And there were some scientists who, kept fighting and kept fighting and kept fighting. And eventually, it was just impossible to deny that lead was getting into the environment and affecting child development. So I think there is a process of scientific, sort of substantiation of key claims. But that aside, it's the breaking of the industry consensus that I think is key. And then once that breaks down, once you've got major industry actors saying, yes, we accept the point that we're basically causing cancer in children or destroying the earth somehow, then regulation happens. I mean, what are politicians going to do? Not regulate at that point? They do. And then the key thing is that you have a negotiation. So you're an industry that's got big factories that it turns out have been doing a lot of harm, and you finally say, yeah, okay, we accept it. We're causing acid rain. We need to change. Then the regulators come to you and they say, look, we're going to regulate you. We could do it tomorrow, or we could do it in 10 years with a lot of advance warning. Of course you would prefer the advance warning. Of course you would prefer time to develop alternatives. Of course you would prefer time to sort of gradually rebuild your operations in a way that will satisfy the regulators. But if you continue to, for example, resist, the regulators can say, you know what, if you don't play ball, we're going to do it tomorrow. So this is a very powerful way, I think, of convincing industries to agree to accept regulation. You get them caught up in a negotiation over the terms and conditions, how strict it is, how fast it comes in, how it applies, how much work it's going to be for them to cooperate with all the paperwork and everything else. The implementation includes a million details, and different firms are going to ask for different things. But if you can get them wrapped up in a negotiation over the terms and conditions, they're no longer in a position to deny the fact that they will sooner or later be regulated. So that's my little model of how we save the world. These processes are dynamic. So, actors that you might sort of describe as opposed in a static sense, at a different point in time, may have a very different political stance. Different industries can be at different points in this process. Arguably, fossil fuel companies have just never left this point. But I think some of them are starting to move beyond. I think it's getting pretty impossible for fossil fuel companies to seriously stonewall, to seriously deny climate change now. I don't think firms often do anything to move beyond what regulation requires of them. So despite all the, perennial interest in, being good sort of corporate citizens that do more than legislators require, for the most part, I don't think they do that. I think public regulation is what works. But they can, in many cases, not oppose that, and then they cooperate with it. So I don't have a huge amount of time, but I'm going to briefly go through sort of some of the details of each of these six,
You have 15 minutes.
Okay. So ozone depletion was basically caused by these chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, which were common in aerosol spray cans and cooling devices, including, large cooling systems in buildings. And the Montreal Protocol was signed in 1987, and this was the sort of key international coordination mechanism. It is arguably humanity's finest hour ever. Every country has signed it, There was no real opposition by that point to the basic thesis that a certain narrow class of chemicals were doing an inordinate amount of harm to this upper layer of the atmosphere. The biggest industrial actor in this story was DuPont, the chemical company. You've probably heard of them. DuPont, in the way I described, initially denied that CFCs were a problem, but then at some point they accepted it. And they had actually already started to develop sort of alternatives, and they saw an opportunity to make money. So they were the biggest actor, but they basically realized, like, oh, this isn't an existential threat to us as a company. We just have to get out of one sort of product line, but actually, compared to a lot of our competitors, we're already more advanced in other product lines anyway. So the industry, once DuPont kind of flipped as a whole, and then, as I say, the world governments could basically sign a global treaty to phase out these chemicals, and that was very effective. So I mentioned lead, was intentionally added to vehicle fuels for a very long time. The worst player in all of this was General Motors, and a subsidiary of General Motors, literally called Ethel Corporation. So when they were developing the internal combustion engine in the early 20th century, they basically realized they had a problem called engine knock. Maybe engineers know more about this than I do. I don't totally understand it, but basically it was a problem with the powertrain in ordinary cars, and they discovered that they could add things to the fuel that would solve the problem. And one of them was not the only one. They could have used others, but they discovered lead actually worked very well. But then roll the clock forward several decades, and in the late 20th century, cities are choking on smog, and somebody invents a magic wand called the catalytic converter. It is a phenomenal thing. It's a box underneath every internal combustion engine car out in the streets of Stockholm, and it basically takes some of the pollutants that were causing smog and turns them into other things that are less harmful. But they don't work with leaded fuel. So ironically, to solve a different environmental problem, General Motors eventually said, I guess lead has to go because we've got to put these catalytic converters in the cars, and lead will sort of mess them up. So eventually, the US and European Union and all the different countries of the world sort of started to mandate that every fuel station provide unleaded fuel. And then over time, we got rid of all the leaded fuel. U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, I should say, played a really shining role in this process. General Motors tried to deny for a long time that lead was a problem, eventually accepted, and sooner or later, all the car companies just changed the cars they were selling. Dioxins, they're still out there. It's not a totally solved problem. I don't want to imply that. In some parts of the world, open burning of solid waste is still a major source of dioxins. But there have been sort of scandals and scares at different points. In Japan, there was a big one at a certain point where vegetables were feared to be sort of contaminated from local waste incinerators. In Sweden, the big issue were pulp and paper producers. And essentially, in the Swedish case, the pulp and paper producers had a good research team working in collaboration with the public sector that had already, when the issue of dioxins sort of exploded onto the agenda in the 1980s, they had already sort of developed ideas for alternative ways of producing all the pulp and paper products we use. So consumers freaked out because at some point people were worried that they were ingesting dioxins from things like coffee filters, baby diapers, stuff like that. It was never actually true, but because the pulp and paper industry was so freaked out about losing consumers, they essentially got rid of chlorine in their production process, and that totally dealt with the problem of dioxins. And the Swedish pulp and paper industry, which is big, said, hey, if we can do this first, we're going to sell a ton of paper products all over the world. Make money. So in this case, again, initially denial, but over a period of time, actually, if anything, the Swedish pulp and paper industry, moved faster than the regulators required. Sulfur dioxide, acid rain, literally used to be making certain parts of Europe like 100 or even more than 100 times more acidic than it would naturally be. A Swedish scientist was instrumental to discovering this problem in the 60s. Turns out a large amount of sulfur dioxide came from smokestacks burning coal, which contains naturally a lot of sulfur. But it turns out you can put essentially devices on smokestacks that extract all the bad stuff, including the sulfur. So if you look out in Stockholm today, when you go home, you'll see all these smokestacks all over the city because, of course, we burn a lot in this city to generate heat in winter. It goes out into district heating systems. But we have to remove all the bad stuff because we burn all the garbage that way and generate all that heat. But smokestack scrubbers are also a phenomenal magic wand for dealing with problems. And because of the growing awareness of this problem of acid rain, which was, killing off fish and destroying aquatic ecosystems, for example, we had the Helsinki Protocol in 1985, and the rest is history. In this case, even if you go back very early, the incinerator operators, they were relatively easy to convince that what they were doing was emitting sulfur that was causing this problem. PFAS is an interesting one. So this has been in the news like really recently. So this is a chemical that's used in things like Teflon pans, Gore-Tex, jackets, stuff like that, things that are water resistant and flame retardants. And there's some scientific uncertainty because there's a lot of different PFAS chemicals. Some of them are undoubtedly very toxic. And in this case, the industry has largely evaded the sort of tentative regulatory efforts so far by just creating new PFAS. There's just like hundreds of them. So they just sort of add a molecule here or there and create something very slightly different. But actually, there are now signs that all PFAS may soon be regulated out of existence, for example, in the European Union. Unfortunately, they're extremely persistent in the environment. That's their benefit. They don't break down. They last forever, essentially. So they'll stay in the environment where they've been sort of spilled, but at least probably there'll be no more production of them. And then mercury is the last one I'll mention here. Mercury is interesting because it comes from a variety of sources. So again, power plants are a source. So you burn coal. Actually, coal contains trace amounts of mercury in many places. So when you burn coal, if the smoke goes up, basically you scatter mercury all around. It's terrible for our bodies. We don't want to have any of it. But there is now an international convention to kind of deal with this called the Minamata Convention. And it does seem like the major incinerators in high-income countries have basically dealt with this problem now. Now, you have a lot of gold mining, so-called artisanal mining, like in Africa. A lot of gold, the world's gold, comes from these really informal kind of local mines. And mercury is an extremely useful way of extracting the gold from ore. And so, unfortunately, it still gets used a lot in those environments. But I would call that a low quality of government problem, predominantly. It's a labor rights issue to a large degree. So, I'm summarizing gigantic amounts of stuff in a very short time. I've got 5 minutes and I'm going to stop. Suffice to say, I don't think solving any of these problems required economic degrowth. I didn't notice it. Did you? I didn't notice the world's population shrinking. Did you? I also didn't notice huge numbers of people out in the streets over these issues for the most part. There were some. There were also, I think, non-trivial levels of public awareness about some of these issues that put some pressure on policymakers. But to a large degree, what I've just described to you is pretty technocratic. Scientists, public regulators, consultations with industry. Yeah, it's carcinogenic. Yeah, you've got a few years to get rid of it. Thanks very much. Here's a law. Comply. Problem solved. So why in the world has it been so hard to do the same thing on climate change? Let's be clear. The cost of solving climate change is actually not that bad, the economic cost. So, Nicholas Stern, this economist, led this huge project to try to, synthesize, like we're talking almost 20 years ago, the whole economics of climate change. 2% of GDP. I don't think the economics of climate change are actually the problem. We have the social wealth. We have the resources. We have the ingenuity to solve the problem. Sometimes people seem to think it would be, we'd have to just dramatically slash our living standards to solve climate change. I don't buy it. I also think the environmentalists who provide that line are just doing a service to the Donald Trumps of the world, who are convinced, trying to convince the electorate all the time that the greenies are out to destroy our standard of living. I think it's very unhelpful. On the contrary, this study just came out in April, a really significant new study of the economics of climate change, in the sense that they used a new economic approach and data set to try to estimate the economic costs of not mitigating climate change. And they put the costs at about 20% of world GDP. In other words, we're going to slice a fifth of our sort of global economic output because we're going to smash it repeatedly, with floods and heat waves and coastal erosion and all of that stuff. So I just don't think the economics explain why we've done so poorly on climate change. It's surprisingly cheap to solve and extremely expensive not to. Here's why I think we've done so poorly on climate change. As far back as you go, every time the scientists started to talk about the problem, the fossil fuel companies did everything they could to block. They stonewalled like the industry did in no other case. And in case you think this is exclusive to, Exxon in the US, there's also a paper trail around some of the international networks around this that reach into Sweden. This was in the news today. So somebody's come up with some new archives that are a bit incriminating about money flowing through Timbro, this sort of shadowy Atlas network that was basically, Koch brothers kind of stuff. They really got the money out there globally. International Chamber of Commerce is also implicated in this. So I think the fascinating thing is that the industry did not accept regulation in the way it did in all these other cases. And I think the big reason for that are the stranded assets. If you own the rights to drill fossil fuels under that patch of ground, and a regulator comes and says, you cannot, it has to stay in the ground, you have just lost a gigantic amount of money, and there is nothing you can do with that asset to convert it into something else. Whereas DuPont could continue producing chemicals with the DuPont name, with DuPont engineers and DuPont labs and factories and so on. In the other cases, regulation was not as much of a sort of existential threat to the relevant industries. With fossil fuels, I think it is. So I think the assets that fossil fuel holders hold are the key part of the story that produce a political outcome, which is why we failed so badly. So let me just wrap up. When we contrast the story of fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions with all the other success cases that I've given you, what's really striking is that industry was really not so bad in all these other cases, but the fossil fuel companies stand out. You have to make a bet if you're an industry that scientists say is causing a big environmental problem. Are regulators coming for us soon? If you think you can stonewall indefinitely, then you probably will do so. If you think the regulators are going to come for you no matter what, then it doesn't make sense to hold out that long because you're just going to spend a lot of money in a losing cause. So there's a little bit of a dynamic kind of game. where you have an unstable equilibrium of a relationship between regulators and firms with the scientists in the background. Because by the time the regulation comes, there's no point in opposing it anymore. You've already lost. So now we're seeing large expansions of low carbon energy. Countries are starting in some cases to reduce their total greenhouse gas emissions. Almost no country has actually eliminated fossil fuel production if it had it. The only example of a country that has actually done anything to actually stop producing fossil fuels it might have otherwise produced is Denmark, which never had a particularly big fossil fuel industry, but it does have one. And what have they done? They promised to kill it by 2050. Now, your first reaction might be, that's pathetic. And in a sense, I agree. But what's the alternative? Every other country is worse. As far as I'm concerned, if that's what it takes, that's what we should do. Because if you can tell the industry, guess what? You're going to keep making money for a while, but it's going to stop, and it really is going to stop, then they know where they stand and they will start making investments to do something else. And they don't have as much reason to oppose the law, which is the big problem we have in the world today. The fossil fuel companies are still resisting as much as they can. So this is my last slide. How do we solve climate change? Well, it's intriguing that spending money is surprisingly easy. You know, the US Inflation Reduction Act spends an insane amount of money subsidizing alternatives to fossil fuels. In a sense, they're doing the World Climate Bank. They're running up public debt, throwing it on to future generations to solve the problem of climate change. If that's our one pathway to do something about this, then I think a really big problem, Joseph might have something to say about this, sort of austerity, you know, people who refuse to run any kind of public debt. Maybe we just need to accept much more public debt to solve this problem. Intriguingly, as some of you know, I've run a survey in 6 countries on public attitudes towards institutions for future generations. And when I pitched it to them in the simplest terms I could find, World Climate Bank was actually extremely unpopular. I think it sounded very unfair to the general public to do what the World Climate Bank proposes to do. But what we ultimately need to do is kill fossil fuels. And the only country I can see so far that provides us a roadmap for how to do that is Denmark. And the solution seems to be to set a very distant but real limit on fossil fuel production and make it credible. And then essentially try to break down the industry consensus that is a collective action problem for them. Try to get some of the capitalists on side who stand to lose out if climate change gets really bad, including, you know, for example, insurance companies and so on. The last thing is, I think we should tell the public and policymakers and industries about the success cases, because capitalists are still there, still making money. You know, we've got good lives in other ways. We didn't have to sort of destroy ourselves to solve these problems. And yet I think sometimes the environmental movement doesn't do itself justice because it suggests that we need to sort of change everything to solve problems. And I don't think that's true. So I'll stop there. Hopefully we can have some discussion.
Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I see hands up in there already. I'll start by just repeating that we have a question and answer period, and we have people online. You write your question in the chat box. Also write what your field is. Since we like to field questions from different fields. That was a lot of different senses of the word field. We do hands and fingers. Fingers are follow up on an earlier question, so then write who you're following up to. But given that, I think I will have a sheet here of some people who want to ask questions directly. And Chandra, you first.
Thank you. Thanks, Malcolm. I really enjoyed that talk. And it's a good question. Why did we succeed in those previous cases and not succeeding with this one? So you don't buy the explanation that, well, I'm not sure if you do or not, that it's because fossil fuels are much more central to the whole global capitalist system. Then all these other cases were not so central to the operating of the whole system. I mean, I have come across that answer. There's a guy named David Schweikart who writes about this, and he kind of tries to make that case. The other question is, you talk about the relationship between capitalists and regulators, and the way you talk about it, you make it sound like I mean, you didn't mention the possibility and the reality in some cases of capitalists just paying up, just stacking up the regulating agencies with their people, right? So what about that power dynamic between capitalists and regulators? You made it sound like the capitalists are afraid of the regulators. I'm not so sure that's always the case.
Yeah, I mean, ooh, this is much louder now. Did everybody miss my whole talk online? Okay. Sorry? Okay. No, two good points. Let me take the second one first. I totally accept your point that sometimes the regulators are in the pockets of the industry. I think that's absolutely true. But they aren't always in the pockets of the industry. You know, I think part of the Stonewall strategy I described, you're absolutely right. It's deny to the public. Meanwhile, whatever, use the revolving door of government and industry to get your people in to prevent action. I think that's totally part of the story. I just didn't mention it, but I don't think that's inconsistent with what I said. At some point, in countries with any sort of plausible functioning government, regulators do have to sort of occasionally say no to the industry, sometimes for the industry's own good, right? Like, okay, you've got a monopoly. We're going to break you up for the good of capitalism here to create multiple companies. Anti-monopoly rules, for example, save capitalism from capitalists. So the regulators do have some measure of independence, but in many cases it's not 100%, as you say. But I don't think that changes my argument. The first point you made, I think, is a little tougher for my argument. I guess, and people do often sort of present this as a comeback. I accept the point that the fossil fuel industry is larger in a sort of absolute sense, by any credible metric, revenues or whatever, total number of workers, if you include everybody in coal mines and everything. This is a bigger operation. But I don't think that changes the fact that the economics of undoing it are very manageable. So Stern, when he first did the Stern review, he's like 1% of GDP could solve the problem. Very quickly, he changed that to 2%. Even if it's 10% of total world income, that's a one-off 10%, right? So that's like 4 years of kind of normal economic growth. So imagine we had to kind of grow the economy for 4 years to solve, arguably the world's greatest problem. It's just not that much. So I think the scale of the capitalist system involved here is problematic predominantly from a political point of view, which is the point I've been trying to make. And I don't think that's inconsistent with what you're saying. But if you tell me, in a sense, the economic challenge is the main barrier, I would push back by giving you some of those kinds of numbers.
You happy with that, Chandra? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, then I will follow up, and there will be some other follow-ups too. Chandra's question about this being a much bigger part of the current capital system. I don't think that was only about cost, but also that the involved companies and states are much more powerful than in the other cases that you described. And I'm not sure you replied to that part, that way of understanding Chandra's question.
So if you're talking about, Saudi Aramco, yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that's my point too.
Okay, so you accept that. So you basically accept we had to pay them out like
I'm saying the political problem clearly has just been much bigger. I think the interesting question is, why have some of these industries, so for a long time they just tried to deny. Now denial is no longer a sort of plausible strategy. But they're still clearly kind of resisting and holding out as long as possible. And they are trying to convince us that their products are essential to make the world go round. That's the important thing also. It's in their interest.
And as you said, I mean, the problem is that they're going to have stranded assets. They don't
Yeah.
have an alternative.
Yeah.
And that will mean much more resistance.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right.
It's
But
not
but
so
what
comparable to the successful cases.
But what I'm saying is we can have a post-climate change capitalism. Now, I might criticize or dislike capitalism for other reasons as well.
But I don't think that was Chandler's point. It's just this current version of capitalism. That's the problem. I mean, you have path dependence. It doesn't mean that you can't have capitalism without fossil.
Imagine I went to the typical capitalist. I love using this word capitalist over and over. And I said, guess what? There's this threat presenting, to the global capitalist system that's going to wipe out 20% of it. How do you feel about that?
Someone else have to solve the problem.
Yeah. No, I mean,
as long as I make my profits.
Exactly. But somebody else, somebody's going to have to pay that price, whether it's insurance companies, whoever's going to have to pay the taxes for all the sort of infrastructure spending that's going to be required to adapt to climate change, et cetera. I don't think that climate change is good for capitalists predominantly.
Global warming is not good for the business climate. Is it take home here? But we had a question in the back, I think to the left, and then Magnus also.
Yeah, thanks for a really interesting talk, first of all. I'm Hugo Faber. I'm a PhD student in political science at Södertörn University. And my own research is precisely about the ways in which fossil industries are trying to influence regulation. And I wanted to follow up on the first question here about the centrality of fossil fuels to capitalism being the kind of thing that sets this case apart from the other cases that you brought up. And what I wanted to add to that is that when you look at this in terms of economics, it's one thing, but there's also this kind of centrality in terms of actually keeping the lights on, so to speak. So what I see in my own research is that one really effective way of influencing regulation, not only blocking it, but actually also creating regulation that is advantageous for the fossil fuel industry, is to really push these energy security narratives, right? So there is this widespread idea that renewables are too intermittent to be able to function, when we have this Dunkelflaute in Europe, for example. So I would say that the economic issue is maybe the easiest to solve, and what we're really seeing is fossil fuel industries pivoting to energy security arguments, and those are much harder for politicians and for regulators to kind of respond to, because the expertise about how to run energy systems lies to a large extent in these industries. You need experts from power companies, for example, to, they work in TSOs and they work in the regulatory agencies and so forth. So they have this kind of stranglehold over the energy security discourse, if you will, or the expert knowledge about energy security. I wonder
Is
what
it
you have
good
to say
if you
about all of
formulate
this.
a question rather than so formulate a question and he will be able to answer?
Yeah, yeah. So I wonder what you think about that. Energy security, isn't that?
So there's two things in what you're saying. Let me split them apart slightly, which is the fossil fuel companies are using the concern about keeping the lights on and the intermittency problem as an argument to sort of defend themselves. That's one.
Yeah.
And two, there's the question of how legitimate those arguments are. So I totally agree with you. That's a major rhetorical device the fossil fuel companies are using now. And I think they have a grain of truth. I'm not going to say there's, zero validity to what they're saying, but I think the validity is limited. So I come from Western Canada. Western Canada has literally just built a new pipeline, fossil fuel pipeline, for like $25 billion. Now, this is insane. And it shows there's plenty of administrative, engineering, technical, construction kind of resources and expertise out there to be used for something. So I think the intermittency problem is real, but if we devote those societal resources to solving that problem, done by bedtime.
Magnus?
Yeah, thanks so much, Malcolm. It was very interesting, I think, too. I just wonder, because to me it seems a bit, I mean, most of what you've said, we kind of know in the sense, and then you kind of run away from the real problem, which I think is the political problem.
Ah,
right?
Magnus, what would we do without you?
No, but I was just wondering about, because I mean there is obviously, it's a huge political problem in the end, and just dividing the world in the good ones and the bad ones, and we have good and evil people and good and evil industries and good and evil politicians. It doesn't really come to a good. I mean, we've been discussing that for ages, I think. And there was this interesting. I just want to hear your opinion on a philosopher that we all know. I think Torbjörn Tännsjö, who was putting up this, I think, quite interesting idea recently, and he has written this new book. But essentially it goes like this, that there is no point what we are doing, since this is a huge political power problem. We're just wasting our time trying to explain for the idiots that they should do something else. And it would be much better just to kind of concentrate all kinds of powers to create what we really need, a global government, or a way of taking global decisions.
No, I don't buy. So I don't buy any of that.
Hold on, I just basically the argument goes like, okay, that will take another 50 years or something, but otherwise, if we're not doing that first, there will be absolutely no way of solving this problem. So I just want to hear your opinion on that. But you don't buy that idea.
No. So what I'm saying is, if I were advising, regulators about what to do about this, and I had a regulator in front of me who agreed with me that we need to solve this problem, we need to solve it urgently, and what we need are new political strategies for doing it, what I would say is, make a law, make it real, make it serious, and when the fossil fuel companies, scream bloody murder, say, you've got 30 years or, 20 years or something. Give them a really long time and say, but if you oppose this, I'm going to make it 5 years.
Okay, but is climate change really a problem? Their problem isn't that a bigger, much more complex problem than just? I mean, we're all part of this, aren't we? It seems to be, to me, it seems very kind of simple to just divide the world in good and bads and tell the evil people to do something else. Is that how this problem works?
Well,
it seems a bit naive to me.
I guess I'm not sure I totally get your point. So, do we all live in a system where our lifestyles are massively influenced by our sort of social, economic, cultural context? Yes. Now, who has influence over that context? In a sense, we all do as voters, although I'm not a voter in this country yet, unfortunately. I used to be an EU citizen. I'm not anymore, unfortunately. But the people in the parliament, the public administrators who stand behind them, civil servants, they're the people who make the laws. And when the laws are right, I think, that changes the context in which we all live. So depending on the decisions that happen, you may be driving a different vehicle 5 or 10 years from now. And therefore, you may not, in fact, when you drive that vehicle, be contributing to climate change, or you may be,
Oh yeah, in one country or something, but the planet is bigger. But anyway.
Sorry, Joseph.
Yeah, thanks a lot for a very nice talk. So my question is about also political. So Germany phases out nuclear energy, but it does kind of not phase out the other stuff. And so has it not still something to do with social mobilization, political parties, and stuff like that, that you focus on something so that you can execute it, and you don't focus on the other stuff and you can't execute it?
So you're saying, in a sense, the political possibility in Germany, because of public opinion, was to get rid of nuclear. Whereas if you, as a German politician, stood up and said, I'm going to close down all coal, you'll just get blown apart.
I don't think you would get blown apart, but nobody was interested in that question.
Yeah, I mean, you will have to enlighten the rest of us about the German obsession with nuclear power. I don't get it. Like, you know, you can't be a good person in Germany and say anything positive about nuclear energy. I don't know why. I don't love nuclear energy. I don't think it's, you know, great, but, you know, to shut down nuclear power plants early, I do think was sort of insane.
Sure, but it was not a regulatory solution. You know, it was like a bottom-up social mobilization solution. So I'm a bit like I'm not completely convinced of the idea that just regulators can solve this.
Well, regulators operate in a political environment. So, you know, if we go back to my slide with, where is it? This graphic. I don't know if I'm still on the, yeah. You know, so, oops. You know, and Gustav's point maybe is a good one. Like maybe we should have some more arrows going around. But what you're describing is this, right? So, you know, there's a decision about shutting down some nuclear power plants with consequences for greenhouse gas emissions, and public attitudes played a big role in making that happen. Yeah, that fits my worldview.
Good, yeah, fine, yeah.
After that, then we move to Moa.
Yes, thank you for a very interesting talk. I still, this is more like a question because I related to the science behind your talk, because I'm still worried that, you know, the big elephant in the room here is still capitalism, and the, you know, the sort of its demand for constant growth, and that even if we, you know, change all the cars to electric cars, and, you know, we really do our best to phase out fossil fuels, I mean, we still have this insane consumption. Is that really, I know that there's been like calculations on this, is it really, is our lifestyle really compatible with a sustainable, you know, handling of the earth, even if we do all of these things? Right.
So I ask myself that question a lot. So I share your concern. I think growth can mean a million different things. Some of them are phenomenally destructive. Some of them are not. Some of them are excellent for our well-being. Some of them are not. Some of them are super yachts for billionaires. Some of them are water systems in Pakistan. You know, I just don't know that it's useful to kind of wrap all of that into this box and just ask, is it good? You know, or is this sustainable? Fossil fuels are not. You know, water systems in Pakistan are. If you focus on electric cars, do they involve digging up, you know, a lot of resources in mines all over the world and putting them together in complex ways? Yeah. Is that a pretty process? No. How bad is it? Probably not as bad as building a typical fossil fuel car and running it for its lifetime. How many people on Earth can have an electric car without us having so many mines? We have no planet left. I think that's a difficult question. But I think you get into really sort of detailed accounting questions about all these specific kinds of resources. I also think, let me say something for capitalism. Capitalism is a phenomenal problem-solving tool. If you give capitalists an opportunity to make money and you ask them to play a competitive game where the solution has all of these rules, but if you know, find the solution, you can sell an insane number of these things to the public and be rich. Well, that's the best you can say for capitalism.
Capitalist, so there's a follow-up from Sandra. Sandra, microphone.
Yeah, how good has it been solving the problem of poverty? I don't think it's that great at problem-solving tool. When you look at real pressing social problems, not really. But just as another follow-up to Moa's, I mean, if, as many people argue, capitalism requires consumerism, continual consumerism, it's pretty hard to think it's compatible with sustainability. I mean, sure, there are some good things that capitalism has done, and nobody denies that. Marx even said that. But eventually, if it's going to keep going, like keep growth, more products, more consumerism, short-term profit above all, it's hard to imagine how that could be sustainable.
I mean, I don't know that I really disagree with what you just said. I think when people talk about consumerism, I have two reactions. One reaction is to say, we know from pretty mainstream like psychological research, people buy tons of stuff that doesn't really contribute to their well-being. We spend stupid amounts of time making money so that we can just blow it on, consumption that doesn't do a whole lot. What do we know from good research on human well-being? Don't have a physical health problem or a mental health problem, have a good social network, be in a happy family. All the rest is details. Don't be poor. Sorry, don't be poor, don't be unemployed. Unemployed people are really unhappy. And, desperately poor people are unhappy, even if they don't have a health problem. But, short of all of that, it's basically about human relationships. So I agree with the criticism of consumerism that we get distracted with all of this stuff. All of us do. So yeah, I agree in a sense. Yeah, you're following on from Mua's point. I think some of this kind of growth is a bit stupid and counterproductive. But my other reaction is to say, yeah, but I also don't really like to be too paternalist and to tell people, how they should live their lives. So I think, in a sense, this raises a different issue, which is what is the proper role of the state in kind of regulating individual people's choices, where their choices have consequences for broader society. And I think that just raises questions beyond the environment as well. Like, if you really like getting drunk, but society has socialized the costs of dealing with your liver cancer, what do we do about that, right? I don't know. That's a philosophical question.
You mean it's a bad question when you say philosophical question?
Well, I'm gonna kick it over to you lot.
Okay, so we have now Tim online. So Tim, turn on your camera, etc.
Hey, great talk, Malcolm. So in your discussion of the possible differences between the ozone layer depletion case and the case of climate change, and possible explanations of why we've done such a good job on one problem and not on the other, you considered a number of things. One was availability of substitutes. I wonder what you think about the idea that in the case of the ozone layer, the perception of the threat was that it was uniformly distributed. So in other words, the worry wasn't that kids in the global south are going to get skin cancer and die. The perception was we're all going to get skin cancer and die. Whereas in the case of climate change, some people in different parts of the globe are expected to be much more adversely impacted than others. And in many cases, people who are in positions of power and who can do something about the problem aren't really in those groups. I'm not trying to deny that we're not all in the same boat when it comes to the case of climate change, but rather I think the perception of the ozone layer case was much more that we're really all in the same boat. Do you think that difference might have some explanatory power, even when you kind of try to set aside the efforts of the fossil fuel industry in resisting regulation?
Yeah, I think you make a good point about that. I think I started thinking about that New Yorker cartoon that probably everybody has seen, where there's this sort of guy sitting cross-legged in a cave with this little boy saying like, yes, we destroyed the earth, but for a little while we made phenomenal amounts of value for shareholders. But I think you're right in a sense that some of the people I've pointed the finger at in this presentation are probably going to be just fine in any plausible scenario with climate change. I think you're probably right that that has something to do with the fact that they could get out of bed in the morning and do the things they've done to just, really mislead the public and harm the world consciously. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, people can delude themselves in all kinds of ways. We know that. So maybe some people just really, really stayed committed to things that we know weren't true, but they really believed were true. But to some extent, I think you're probably right that there's some calculus that some of those people made that basically said, yeah, it's too bad, but I'm not really worried about it for me and the people I care about, or maybe even my whole country. Yeah, I think you're right.
Happy with that, Tim?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, next on the list is actually me. I have lots of questions, small ones. I just pick out some. I mean, one thing was you were talking about the stories you described with environmental success stories. They didn't really involve much social movements. But I gather that you don't draw from that conclusion that we don't need it for, let's say, climate change, because especially where we need it might be when we have failed. So we have to study the other failures and see. I mean, we can't just say, maybe we get a success very easily when we don't need a social movement, but for other things we do it. And I guess then you could look at the cases where we seem to have known, I mean, overthrowing different kind of apartheid systems, seem to have needed kind of social movements and imposing cost on it. So that was the first one. And then the other thing I don't think came up in your talk, and I would like your reflection on, is speed. I mean, many of the success stories, they were moving pretty fast in causing harm, people here and now, and the solution was also moving fast. You could see that it worked very quickly. Unfortunately, climate change is not like that in both ways. Sure, we see some of the effects of climate change already, but the really bad ones are always a little bit further in the future. And the effect of stopping climate change is, you're not going to see it it's going to take a long time before you see it, which makes it much harder to sell and much harder intergenerational problems to sell politically. That I didn't see coming up in your talks. I would like to hear if you have any views about that.
Yeah, great questions. Okay, so somebody says, they're going to make it their mission to mobilize people, to care more about this, to put more pressure on, politicians to weight more of their voting towards, green stuff. Bravo, like I'm on side with that. Yeah, I'm not trying to discourage people from organizing social movements and mobilization to help put pressure on politicians to solve climate change. I'm just making the observation, because I say that because I do hear in some circles in academia a general view that we just somehow need to build, a bigger and bigger movement. That's the only thing we should really kind of do. That's their main focus. And I think it's a worthy focus. I don't think it's doing any harm. It's clearly doing some good. But the presentation of that I think is sometimes problematic is this, in a sense, focus on capitalism. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, to me, it seems more like let's put the finger on specific capitalists and maybe try to win over a few other capitalists to our side, because I don't know that climate change is going to be good for them, and I don't think they have much to gain from staying loyal to the fossil fuel industry specifically, which is most of the problem. So yes to social movements, and I think it's a little bit of a question of who you sort of think of as the target and who you might not target, in a sense. I like your point about other failures. I think the problem is different environmental problems do raise quite different issues and raise very different sorts of technical, economic, and so on challenges. So I think for me, one of the biggest outcomes of the whole sort of, I don't know, last 5 years of my experience in this place has been a growing sort of consciousness of how different, for example, biodiversity is as an issue, the issues with food production. I've learned a lot from hearing presentations from people in this room, talking to people in this room, and I'm still sort of trying to process how to think about that. I actually think biodiversity loss, or the crisis of nature, is a harder problem than climate change. Climate change, we basically have a technological vision for solving. Electrify everything. We don't have a technological vision for solving land use, food production, biodiversity type stuff. Kareem is smiling at me, and I've learned a lot about this from conversations with Julia too, thinking about biodiversity. So I think studying other failures, unfortunately, gets into really tricky questions of very different sorts of economic challenges. So I've tried to sell you today on the basic thesis that we can do it on climate change. We really actually don't need to change that much. The only things I think on climate change that we really need to change in our lifestyles, because we have no technological solution for them, are meat and long distance travel. Because we don't have any way to plausibly decarbonize, long haul air travel for like 30 years. Probably we'll find something eventually, but for the foreseeable future, the only thing we can do with air travel is offset it with, emission, basically negative emissions somewhere else. As for speed, I agree. There is something about climate change that is this sort of slowly unfolding disaster that maybe sets it apart from all the others I've talked about. I think there's something to that.
Not only that, but also slowly seeing the effect of doing something about it.
Yeah. No, I think there's probably something to that. I don't think, actually, this gets a little bit into your domain, I don't think the public says, we don't care about future generations. I don't think they think about them that much, but I think very few people really care so little that they're just like, after I'm gone, whatever. I don't really think many people are like that.
But we knew that from our study.
We get some evidence. So yeah, I think our study kind of shows that. I don't think that people consciously are saying, let's not do anything about climate change because I'm going to be gone. I don't think that's a big thing we need to argue against. But I do think the slowness of it means it keeps getting kicked down the political agenda. Look at the current government in Sweden, right? Other than some cranks in, the Sweden Democrats, I don't think the major parties running this country right now are climate deniers. It's just not something they think about that much. They're just not that interested in this issue. So the only thing they can talk about is nuclear power, which, might materialize someday.
But it might be, democracy is very good in many ways, but this might be an intrinsic problem to the kind of democratic system we have. They're very hard dealing with exactly these kind of problems. So because they have to, win the next election, and that leads to kicking the can down. That's just what I say. I'm not saying this like that, but that's something.
But then why have I noticed in Stockholm people driving around with vans that say Nya tunnelbana, see you in 2033? Somehow the political process in this country is able to deal with long-term challenges like the need for new metro lines that aren't going to be ready for like a decade. And that's a conservative agenda.
Maybe we have a more classic long term, and that's this defense. And usually what you get into then is having kind of very broad coalitions. For some reason, we haven't succeeded with that with climate change. So I think that should be studied by people like you, political sociologists. We have succeeded when it comes to defense, and we have this kind of threat, then you have very long-term policies.
I mean, I think we probably mostly agree about this. Yeah.
All right. Anyway, so then join me in thanking for this extremely inspiring and stimulating talk. And I guess we'll hear more about this over the coming years.
I think so.
And we have actually some more talks coming up. June 12th, Palle Dahlstedt, Professor of Interaction Design and Software Engineering. He's going to talk about creative AI implication for art and artists. A little bit different from this talk. And then June 19, our own Katarina Bernd Rasmussen will speak about something that's not yet announced, but I'm sure it's going to be great. Welcome then.